Not every unexplained event in history is related to the paranormal. Even those we once believed were supernatural in nature can sometimes be revealed as unusual but explained scientific phenomena. There still remain many things that are not so easily explained, though, and for now, the paranormal is one of the best explanations we have. Number 5. Poltergeists feature in many of the most unexplained stories of paranormal activity. It can be easy to explain disembodied footsteps or shadows in the corner of the eye as tricks of the mind. But when objects are physically moved across the room, it can be much harder to explain. England has a wealth of poltergeist stories, which usually feature tormented families, unable to live in peace due to the scary activity. The most famous of these, such as the Enfield haunting, are made into TV shows and movies, but there are many more that don't get attention outside the local area. The West Dalton Poltergeist is one such haunting. West Dalton is a town in Greater Manchester, not far from the city of Bolton. There's been a settlement here since at least the 11th century, and many historic events have taken place in the area. But it wasn't a house with hundreds of years of history that the West Dalton Poltergeist decided to haunt. Wingate's Grove is a quiet residential street at the edge of West Dalton. The homes are all less than 100 years old, with most being semi-detached houses that were built between the 30s and 60s. There are no stories of gruesome crimes that took place there during that time, and for the most part it seems as ordinary as any other street. But that changed in the 1990s. At one point, most of the houses were still rented by the local council. One of the homes was occupied by a young family. They didn't have any problems until 1993, when strange, unexplained things began to happen. A weird oil-like substance began to ooze from the walls, and puddles of water were found on the floor. Objects, including a ceramic horse, would be thrown around the room by an unseen force. The family went to the local paper about the strange occurrences, and they were encouraged to seek spiritual help for the strange phenomena. They contacted a medium and a priest, who blessed the house while the medium conducted an exorcism. According to some stories, the family were rehoused somewhere where the walls didn't drip with a mysterious substance, while other versions of the story say the haunting stopped after the exorcism. Whichever is true, the Wingate's Grove area returned to the quiet, normal neighborhood for a few years at least. In 1999, a new family moved into one of the houses on the street, a few doors down from where the original poltergeist happenings had occurred. Even before they had moved in, the family got a strange feeling about the location. Laura, who was 12 at the time, told her mother she didn't want to move in and felt like they were invading someone else's private space. The family moved in anyway, and when the children continued to talk about ghosts, they were told it was likely the ghost of their grandfather. The children weren't too certain. Early on during their stay at the haunted house, Laura and her older brother were running up the stairs after pulling a prank on a friend in the living room. Laura's brother wounded his foot on a picture frame that was standing upright on the stairs. It had been on the wall moments ago, and Laura couldn't understand how the frame was still standing upright even after being stepped on. Another story from Laura's time in the house was when her brother's girlfriend stayed with them. Laura woke in the middle of the night to see the woman standing over her bed, staring at her. Somehow, Laura managed to make it back to sleep. She told her mother about it in the morning, but didn't think too much of it. She figured that the woman likely sleepwalked, or there was some other mundane explanation. The woman later claimed that she'd woken up to the exact same thing: Laura standing over her bed in the middle of the night. They had both woken up at different times and had no memory of their late-night walks. The third child in the haunted house didn't seem too concerned about the paranormal experience. He was Laura's nephew and would talk to someone nobody else in the house could see. He called the ghost the big guy and didn't seem to think there was anything scary about this mysterious individual. In some versions of the story, the first family also had a toddler who could see the entity, or some of the entities at least. This toddler would spend time playing with the ghost in his bedroom and listening to stories told by someone he called the Little Man. Like the first time the West Dalton poltergeist came to visit, the family reported strange substances dripping from their walls. At first, they thought there was a leak, but plumbers could find no explanation for the mysterious liquid. The liquid didn't seem to be water and was described as being baby oil-like. A A sample of the wallpaper was taken for testing, but came back inconclusive, as there wasn't enough of the substance for testing. The heating system would turn on and off by itself, and repairmen would find nothing wrong with it. After going to the council about the strange happenings, the family were advised to contact the medium that had gotten rid of the spirit for their neighbors. The medium explained that sometimes poltergeists don't actually go away but lie dormant in the area, waiting to attach themselves to somebody else. The family eventually moved out of the house after 4 years, and the haunting apparently didn't follow the family when they moved to Liverpool. It was still a traumatic experience for Laura, though, who told the local newspaper that she had the experience in her doctor's notes. She also shared a few more scary stories from their experience living in the haunted house. On one occasion, she heard her brother come home from work and waited for him to come upstairs so they could watch a TV show together. She and a friend heard the sound of keys being put down, but then the noise stopped. After 20 minutes, Laura went to see where her brother was. At that moment, he came into the house, having only just arrived home. A confused Laura explained what she had heard, but her brother told her he'd only just gotten back. The keys were still in the door, and the taxi he had used to get home was just driving away. A search of the house revealed no intruder, and Laura and her friend were unable to explain what they had heard. On another occasion, the family discovered dozens of crows had apparently dropped out of the sky over their house, covering their front and backyard and the alleyway at the side of the house. Like the other mysteries surrounding the house, there was no ordinary explanation for this strange occurrence. Since then, the paranormal activity at Wingates Grove has subsided, but there are still stories of strange occurrences. The person who now lives in Laura's old home told the papers that the only paranormal experiences she's had are windows apparently opening by themselves. However, in 2010, there were reports of another paranormal incident taking place on the street, with the resident reporting her bed being shaken by an unseen entity, disembodied voices, and other objects being moved around the house. If the West Dalton poltergeist returned, it was apparently a lot more active now and wanted attention. Who or what the poltergeist may have been is also a mystery. There were some reports of children at a local school using a Ouija board, but they were not the same children that lived on the street, so it seems unlikely that this was the cause. It's possible whatever was haunting the homes has been there for much longer than the houses themselves had been. Number 4. Around the world, there are many stories of harbingers of doom. These supernatural creatures appear shortly before a disaster and disappear without a trace after the disaster has taken place. Some believe they themselves are the cause of the disaster. Others believe the creatures are simply drawn to something that would happen, whether they were or not. The Little Red Man of Tuileries is slightly different from the more famous harbingers such as the Mothman. He wasn't a dark, menacing presence who lingered before a catastrophe. He appeared to only a few select individuals, but to see him would certainly mean doom. Tuileries was a royal palace built beside the River Seine in Paris and located near the Louvre Palace. Building started under the command of Catherine de' Medici, then mother to King Francois II of France, but it wouldn't be completed until the reign of King Henry IV some 30 years later. From then on, it served as a home to all of the French royals, including the later Napoleon and Napoleon III. It was destroyed in 1871 during the Paris Commune, but stories of the spirit that used to live there lived on. The Red Man is at least as old as the palace itself. There are 2 origins for this strange spirit, each involving Catherine Medici. Catherine had been married to the previous king, Henry II, and had built political power in spite of her government. That included using a butcher named Jean to get rid of her enemies. Being in such a role, Jean knew a lot of the queen's secrets, and Catherine decided she needed to get rid of him too. She hired a man named Neuville to do the job. Neuville took Jean's life in the gardens of Tuileries. He left the body there, but when he came back, Jean was missing. Not long after, Catherine's astrologist had a vision and said that all inhabitants of Tuileries would meet a horrifying end. She said that Jean would haunt Tuileries until it was destroyed. Another version of the story said that Catherine had moved into the new palace before it could be completed. Every night, the Little Red Man would appear on the upper floors. He told her he would pass away near Saint Germain. Catherine abandoned the palace not because of the Civil War as history books report, but because it was located in the parish of Saint Germain. Catherine managed to avoid anywhere near Saint Germain for the rest of her life, but would eventually pass away from natural causes. The priest who gave her her last rites was named Laurent Saint Germain. In neither story did the Red Man cause Catherine's passing, possibly because she would never end up living at the palace, but his predictions were much more immediate to others that saw him. Descriptions of the Red Man vary. In some stories, he looks relatively ordinary, but dressed completely in red. Other stories say he has a hunchback, hooked nose, one eye, cloven feet, or a combination of the features. Whether he looked like an ordinary person or something more demonic, he struck fear into the hearts of those that saw him. Victims of the Red Man include Henry IV. He appeared either to the king himself or to others in the palace on the morning that Francois Ravaillac took his life in 1610. He would later appear to the wife of King Louis XIII before a series of civil wars in France, and to King Louis XIV shortly before he passed away due to disease. Of course, he would also appear to the most famous doomed residents of Tuileries. The Red Man appeared several times during the French Revolution, apparently often wearing the cap of liberty. He appeared in the king's bed during this flight from the palace, and a group of Marie Antoinette's ladies spotted him days before the storming of the palace. Like with other harbingers of doom, it's not possible to say whether he predicted the disasters or if he was the cause of them. What is certain is that every time someone spotted the strange omen, it was bad news for whoever was royalty at the time. That was the case up until Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte was a believer in the supernatural, folklore, and prophecies. Stories of the Red Man were also being published in both England and France by the time he came to power, so he knew of the creature and what it had meant for previous royals. But the Red Man appeared to Bonaparte before he was even crowned a monarch, and far away from the French palace. The story goes that the Red Man first appeared to Bonaparte in Egypt before the Battle of the Pyramids. This was one of the most successful battles in the French campaign in Egypt, and the Red Man predicted as much. But he also told Napoleon that the French fleet had not obeyed his orders and the campaign would fail. And sure enough, the rest of the campaign in Egypt didn't go in Napoleon's favor, and he had to leave for France. Before departing, though, the Red Man predicted that Napoleon would have 10 years of success on the battlefield in Europe. Some versions of the story also claim the Red Man was heard uttering the word Moscow during the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon would see the Red Man at least twice more. Some stories say that he frequently consulted the Red Man on military campaigns. One general claimed to have even seen Napoleon staring up at the sky one night. When Napoleon didn't respond to any sounds, the general took hold of Napoleon's arm. It was then that the French emperor pointed out a red star and said that it was the Red Man of destiny. The next prediction of the Red Man came before the Battle of Wagram, which was a French victory. However, the specter warned Napoleon against attacking Moscow, predicting that it would not go well. Of course, Napoleon marched on Moscow anyway. A scorched earth policy from the Russians, combined with extended supply lines and an early winter, wiped out a huge portion of Napoleon's army. The final visit from the Red Man came in 1814. He told Napoleon that he had 3 months to work out a peace deal with his enemies, or he would be confined to a tiny island. Napoleon argued that he couldn't negotiate peace in 3 months, but the Red Man's prediction would come true. Napoleon would be forced to abdicate 3 months after the Red Man's final visit and was banished, first to the island of Elba and then to St. Helena. The final story of the Red Man states that he appeared to the caretakers of the palace in 1871. The caretaker was doing his rounds one night when he spotted the figure dressed all red and standing in what was described as a melancholy posture. When the caretaker asked what the figure was doing, he vanished, only to reappear further away. Not long after, the palace was destroyed, and the Red Man hasn't been seen since. If the Red Man was tied to the building, it's possible that this creepy creature is gone forever. But if the Red Man had been in the area long before Catherine Medici decided to build her palace there, it may be waiting for the next person who dares to call its home theirs. Number 3. Around the world, there are certain places that seem to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. Most of the activity we see is on land, but it's even more disturbing and confusing when the unexplained happens out on the ocean or in the skies above it. The most famous of these strange areas is the Bermuda Triangle, but it's far from the only one. On the other side of the world, in the waters off the coast of Australia, is an even more mysterious triangle. The Bass Strait is in an area of water that separates the island of Tasmania from the rest of Australia. Today, it's an important shipping lane, as the city of Melbourne is nearby, but it's still a patch of rough water and dangerous to travel through without proper equipment. It would have been even more dangerous to travel through the strait in the past, when charts weren't as detailed and ships weren't as powerful. But even that can't explain the number of unexplained disappearances, or the unidentified objects and lights that are sometimes seen in the sky above the strait. From the beginning, the Bass Strait had been a mysterious location. It was first properly investigated during a rescue mission for the Sydney Cove in 1797. One of the first ships that had ever explored the east coast of Australia was wrecked on an island called Preservation Island. 2 other ships were sent out to rescue survivors and whatever cargo they could. One of the ships, the Francis, completed the operation without issue and discovered a lot about the strait, as well as recovering the first scientifically studied wombat. The Eliza, though, disappeared without a trace. Over the next 200 years, countless other ships would go missing. It wasn't a regularly traveled route until after Melbourne was established, which makes the number of missing ships even more perplexing. Between 1838 and 1840, 7 ships disappeared without a trace in the strait, including the British warship HMS Sappho. Given the size of the ship, which had 100 people on board, the fact it disappeared without a trace was all the more mysterious. The disappearances continued into the 1900s. In September of 1920, 2 ships and an aircraft all disappeared without a trace. The German ship, the SS Amelia J, vanished in the body of water. A major search effort took place, which included many ships and military aircraft. During that search, the SS Southern Cross and a military aircraft both vanished. Those who don't believe in the paranormal explain the mysterious disappearances away as being caused by storms or other bad weather. The area is known for its challenging waters, but that wouldn't necessarily explain why so many ships have completely disappeared, leaving nothing and nobody behind. It also wouldn't explain why some ships and aircraft vanish, even when the weather is optimal. One of the most mysterious disappearances is that of Miss Hobart. The Miss Hobart had been traveling a routine flight across the strait with 11 people on board during optimal conditions in October of 1934. At one point, the pilots got in touch with air traffic control to report an unusual buzzing sound. They later reported that the sound stopped, and the plane vanished not long after. The most famous mysterious audio from the strait comes from the disappearance of Frederick Valentiche, who vanished in October of 1978. Again, conditions were good, and Valentiche was crossing the strait to travel to Melbourne. During the flight, a panicked Valentiche contacted air traffic control to report that there was something else in the skies with him. He couldn't identify the aircraft or even if it was civilian or military. He claimed it was circling above him and keeping pace. His final disturbing message claimed it wasn't an aircraft. Some believe that Valentiche had gotten disoriented and was flying upside down. What he was describing was his own plane in the water below him. Others believe he had taken his own life. Valentiche allegedly had an interest in UFOs, which might explain why he decided to create a mystery before vanishing. Others believe Valentiche was able to reveal the truth about the strait before vanishing without a trace. Valentiche was far from the only person to have seen and reported UFOs above the strait and the surrounding areas. There are many stories of mysterious flying aircraft in the area, and a rash of sightings around the time Valentiche disappeared. One mysterious aircraft was caught on camera the day of Valentiche's disappearance. A man named Roy Manifold was taking photos of the sunset over the Bass Strait when he captured a strange object that supposedly looks like an exhaust trail. It was almost as if he had photographed an invisible aircraft above the water, just 20 minutes before Valentiche would vanish. Roy went inside after taking the photo, but his son stayed out to look at the sunset a little longer. He described hearing a Cessna engine overhead even though there was no aircraft in the sky. After a short period of time, it suddenly stopped. It wasn't as if the plane had flown away. The sound hadn't gotten quieter. It just abruptly stopped as if a radio had been cut off. Others reported a strange green light over the strait that day. Between the strange lights, objects, and missing people, ships, and aircraft, it seems that something unexplained might be living off the coast of Australia. Number 2. There are lots of villages around the UK that claim to be the most haunted, but Prestbury may just take that title. Having over 30 documented ghosts that wander through the streets and cause fear in people and animals alike, the village dates back to at least 899 and is likely much older. It was settled by priests, which is what gave the location its name. The name literally means priest's fortified place. It's believed that it may have been occupied even earlier, as archaeologists have found urns and signs of sacrifices that are believed to be pre-Christian. With such a long and ancient history, it's not surprising that there are many ghosts that have decided to call this place home, though the most famous ghosts date back to the 1400s or later. There are 2 stories of phantom ghosts and their spectral riders that are said to haunt the streets. The horses can often be heard galloping down the oldest street in the village, before a scuffle of some kind, then silence. Normally, these phantoms cannot be seen, but some unlucky witnesses have seen the haunting figures as well as heard them. The earliest of these ghosts is believed to date back to May 4th, 1471. This was the date of the Battle of Tewkesbury, a decisive battle in the War of Roses that took place not far from Prestbury. The story goes that a messenger was on his way to the camp of King Edward IV when he was struck by a Lancastrian arrow. Edward would win the Battle of Tewkesbury anyway, but the messenger was forgotten. In the 20th century, the skeletal remains of a man with an arrow in his chest were discovered, believed to belong to the spirit that had been haunting the area ever since his end. The next phantom horseman originated from another war some 200 years later. During the English Civil War, the county as a whole sided with the Royalists. There was also a Royalists' camp on the nearby Cleeve Hill, which overlooks the village of Prestbury. However, stationed in the village itself were men loyal to Oliver Cromwell. Any message from Cleeve Hill to the rest of the county would have to go through Prestbury. The soldiers set a trap using a rope or wire across the Bur gauge, which tripped the horse of a messenger one night. The man was thrown from his horse before the horse galloped away in fright. The soldiers took what information they could from the man and then ended his life. The messenger is now believed to be a headless horseman that haunts the road. The sound of his horse falling, a short silence, and then the horse galloping away in fear can still be heard. There are many other ghosts that are associated with the Civil War. One story tells of a boy who was afraid to stay in the kitchen alone because he claimed he didn't like the soldiers. When asked to describe the soldiers, he described specters wearing outfits similar to those worn during the Civil War. The most famous ghost in Prestbury may have come from between those 2 times, though nobody knows for certain. The Black Abbot is the ghost most often seen on the streets of Prestbury. He's most often seen on Easter, All Saints' Day, and Christmas, walking from St. Mary's Church through the churchyard and through the wall of one of the oldest cottages. Descriptions of the ghost vary. Some describe him as looking so lifelike they believe he's a living monk in a monk's habit, who simply disappears when they get close to him. Others describe him as something more ghostly, but still wearing the black robes that earned the ghost its title. Many believe this is the ghost of an actual monk or abbot that served in Prestbury at one point. The journey his ghost now takes is one that he would have taken every day. He now remains trapped in that loop, not aware of his surroundings and unaware of the fact that he's no longer alive. Another theory is that he was created during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, and represents the hatred and fear that was present during that era. For the most part, the ghost is harmless, and most describe it as not even acknowledging the living. Others have stories of the specter staring at them, sending shivers up their spines. It's alleged that the ghostly monk has been banished from St. Mary's Church after an exorcism, but he still continues to walk through the graveyard and street, and can still be seen to this day. Number 1. We often think of witch trials as being a thing of the past. When things that couldn't be explained started to happen, the most vulnerable in society were blamed for the strange occurrences. Today, science can normally explain those weird occurrences. Even if someone is suspected of being a witch, it's unlikely to result in any kind of legal action. But in the 1980s in Italy, a series of strange occurrences led to a 20-year-old woman being accused of being a witch and put on trial. The woman in question was Carol Compton. Carol was from Scotland and had lived there most of her life. There were a few occurrences of strange things happening around her in Scotland. Things would go missing, only to reappear days later in a location that had already been checked. Electrical equipment would break without explanation. The conveyor belt at the factory where she worked broke suddenly, wounding Carol. It was just frequent enough for Carol to question if this was more than just a coincidence. But in July of 1982, the strange curse seemed to be far from her mind. Carol had been dating an Italian man named Marco, who'd been in Scotland as part of his military service. After 3 years, he'd returned to Rome to complete his service. The young couple got engaged and Carol decided to move out to Rome to be with him. She got a job as a live-in nanny for a wealthy family, and that was when trouble really began. Things had started off well enough, and the Ricci family had welcomed Carol into their home. She was to look after their 2-year-old son, Emmanuel, but not everybody got along with Carol. One of the maids, a superstitious woman named Rosa, was in the room when a religious painting fell off the wall as Carol walked past. She believed it was a sign that there was something wrong with the nanny, and made Carol say a short prayer. Other things would happen around the house. Bowls would jump off the table without anyone touching them. The boiler would break whenever Carol was nearby, and other electrical equipment stopped working. Rosa asked Mrs. Ricci to fire Carol, but the family kept the nanny for a few more months. Then the family went on vacation to their holiday home, taking Carol with them. One evening, a fire started without explanation in one of the upstairs rooms. Carol was found outside with Emmanuel, allegedly in a trance as she stared at the flames. She hadn't called the fire department or warned Emmanuel's grandfather, who was still in the house. When the fire brigade was called, they suspected an electrical fire. The family went to stay at a friend's holiday home, where 2 more fires broke out. One was in close proximity to Emmanuel, and the family decided it would be better to let Carol go. The family didn't report any of the strange happenings to the police or to the agency that Carol worked for. She soon found a new position with the Tonti family, looking after a 3-year-old girl. Straight away, it was very clear Carol wasn't welcome there. Enkila Chechkini, the family grandmother, made it clear she didn't like Carol. It was nothing personal though. She'd already gotten rid of the past 4 nannies. Unfortunately for Carol, the paranormal activity continued in the Tonti home. Statues, especially religious statues, would break when Carol was around. Other objects would fall over in the room Carol slept in, and she reported hearing a strange scratching sound that nobody else could hear. Then there was the next fire. Carol had placed the children on a bed to sleep and pushed the cot up next to the bed so that the child wouldn't roll off. Not long after, black smoke began to pour from the room. The cot mattress had caught fire for no reason. The child was rescued from the room without harm, but it was believed the whole thing could have been much worse. Enkila accused Carol of being a witch. The rest of the family wasn't too convinced about the paranormal, but did believe the nanny was responsible for the fire. She was arrested and held in prison for 16 months while awaiting trial. The accusation of Carol being a witch made headlines in Italy and in the UK. Many in Italy were embarrassed that this superstition was making headlines, but the fact was that the occurrence was very strange. In almost all the fires, Carol had been nowhere near where they started, but that was just seen as evidence that Carol had started the fire with her mind rather than with a match. The fire investigations that took place after she was charged only added to the rumors that the events had been supernatural. Fire investigators claimed that the fires were like nothing they had seen before. The fires would move downwards, not up, and hadn't been caused by a flame. Instead, they had to have been created by an intense heat. This seemed to be a sign to many people that the fire was unnatural. However, the same investigator did mention that the fires could have been caused by something as simple as an iron. While Carol awaited trial, new stories from her time with the Ricci family emerged, including the claim that the child would cry out as if he was burned whenever Carol touched it. Carol was also psychiatrically evaluated, but that she had what they called a naughty personality. They believed Carol had started the fires so that the families would leave their vacations early and return to Rome, where she could be with her boyfriend again. Throughout everything, Carol denied having anything to do with the fires. She also declined help from UK paranormal investigators who had worked on cases like the Enfield Poltergeist. She wanted to distance herself as much as possible from the possibility that the events were supernatural in nature. When the trial eventually went ahead, a medium and spiritualist burst into the courtroom carrying a wooden cross, which she pressed into the cage where Carol was being held. The medium claimed that Carol and her mother were possessed by the devil, and she wasn't responsible for what had happened. The woman was eventually removed, but not before traumatizing Carol further. There was only circumstantial evidence in the case, but Carol was eventually found guilty of arson and attempted arson, and not guilty of trying to take the life of another. She was sentenced to time served and released. Carol continued to maintain her innocence and wrote a book about her ordeal, but tried to put the experience behind her after moving back to the UK. In the decades since, many paranormal experts have questioned just what happened to Carol. Some believe that poltergeists were responsible for the strange fires and other activities. Everything that happened in Carol's presence lines up with other stories of poltergeists. Others point to the mysterious Sicilian fires of 2004, which could never be properly explained, and believe that the same thing was responsible for this case. Since the incidents, Carol has been able to live a normal life, settling down with a man named Zaruf Ahmed in Yorkshire. So far, it doesn't appear as if whatever caused the paranormal events followed her home. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.